Here on the main stage, we're going to talk about procurement and how it's broken and how it can be reworked to better integrate startups. We have some amazing speakers to talk about this too. We have Katherine Brownson from S2 Ventures, Sir Chris Deverell from Deverell Innovation Ventures, and John Riggs from the UK Ministry of Defence. And moderating this panel is Dr. Alison Hawks of BMNT. Give them a round of applause.
Wonderful. Well, great to be here and to be with this panel to talk about procurement reform. And having been a founder in the UK and securing MOD contracts and founding a charity in the UK and also securing MOD contracts, I understand the difficulty and the requirement for procurement reform, but I also think that it is a really embittered kind of excuse of why things are wrong when we're trying to adopt technology and work with startups and SMEs. So on the panel today, I think what I want to start out with is a statistic that's been bandied around a little bit, maybe for about 6 months, where in an effort to do procurement reform, the government has indicated or set a standard for the percentage of contracts that need to go to small companies, startups, SMEs, and that's around 35%. And the number that came out a few months ago that was publicized is that 67% of that 35% goes to primes. And so developing policies where we indicate the behavior that we want to see or the standards that we want to set are either not being enforced or are not creating the right incentives to change behaviors and buying behaviors to enable the technology adoption that we need to have a competitive advantage. So the question that I want to open to the panel is, what must be true for policies like this to be enforced? And are there better ways to approach procurement reform? And John and Chris, from a government perspective and what you've done, and Katherine from helping companies overcome these hurdles and what you would like to see in reform.
Shall I kick off?
Yes.
So John Ridge, I'm the Innovation Director in the Ministry of Defence, at least for a few more weeks, and then I'm heading off to the NATO Innovation Fund as the Chief Adoption Officer. I think I recognise the points that you make there. One of the major challenges for us is that we've got a system of acquisition that's configured for a world that started to come to an end about 15, 20 years ago and definitely feels very different. So we've got a system that's configured for defence providing the money that does the research and development. It's defence research, and then we take that through and we have a limited number of defence primes that then deliver those platforms, normally against kind of decade-long programmes, against a very tight specification with an integrator and everything else. And what's not happened yet is we've not shifted that system to reflect the reality now, which is that most of these transformative technologies are not coming out of defence-funded research. They're coming out of academia, they're coming out of the private sector, and so you have to have a very different relationship with your industry base. And it's not surprising, if your system's configured for a completely different world, you shouldn't be surprised that it doesn't work. Picking up on the specifics of acquisition and how to engage SMEs a little bit more than we do at the moment, and I'm sure others will talk to this, the barriers to entry of dealing with the MOD, and DASA, the Defence and Security Accelerator, comes as part of my directorate, tries really hard to do this, to engage SMEs, but we still set up some very, very significant barriers to entry in terms of you need to have all these accreditations, you need to fill out this form, often having to get into a framework. It's just a lot for an SME to take on. And the incumbents have been through all of that, and they're on established terms and everything else, and it's not yet a level playing field. I'll stop there, there are loads more, but I'll let others come in.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, well, so I think the first thing I would say is I'm sceptical about those figures you quoted. You quoted the SME 35% target for SMEs. I mean, I don't really understand the methodology by which those figures are derived, and I don't see a huge amount of evidence of them being audited. And certainly, you know, if you form an impression from those figures that there's a vast array of startups that are doing business with MOD, you would be wrong. You know, a lot of that spend on SMEs is indirect spend through the primes to traditional small businesses around the country. And that's great and to be encouraged. but it doesn't mean that startups are getting the traction that they should. And partly that is because, and this is really to elaborate on John's point, if you read the MOD's SME action plan, or the MOD's integrated procurement model, or the MOD's science and technology strategy, or the MOD's defense, industrial and security strategy, none of them mention venture capital or startups. So it's just not really in the mindset. And that desperately needs to change for the reasons that John has described.
Thank you.
It's a really good point about the fact that they don't even mention the startup or venture capital field. So from a startup perspective, there's a lot of hurdles and barriers to entry that we face. And if you haven't worked in the defense sector prior, it is a daunting process to go through. I've worked the holistic life cycle from being a startup to being at SOCOM to writing requirements for technical pieces, giving congressional posture statements, to kind of revamp how we go about doing these things. So I've been lucky enough to understand the language, the different acronyms, which offices to reach out to, and that as a startup, whether you're a large company, a prime, a sub, you have a right and you should utilize your voice. You can reach out for questions if things on a solicitation don't necessarily make sense. The entire package, the way you have to put everything together is a daunting process if you haven't worked in the industry before. So we do our best to help startups kind of face that process. There's certainly a lot that can be done on the government side to make that more streamlined or a more unified process.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And I think that one of the things that I've observed in terms of the requirements for change is we need to have structural change, so you take down those barriers of the forms and the accreditations. But there's also an education on behalf of industry of developing the confidence to do those things that you've talked about, and knowing that, that kind of big, scary solicitation you're trying to go for is that you do have a voice, that you can ask those questions, and developing the confidence to do that. Chris, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your time at J-Hub. So you were the driving force behind starting up alongside Henry Willey, the J-Hub, which at the time was a radical departure for how the MOD engaged with technology and startups and the ecosystem and solving problems. A couple questions for you to kind of inform the rest of the discussion. What problem were you solving when you set the J-Hub up? And do those problems still exist? Or have you seen new ones as a result of it? Because J-Hub is now an established part of the Innovation Secretariat. It's kind of the leading force, I think, in the operational side of innovation. But where it started, what problem were you solving?
So firstly, I'm very pleased and proud of what we did with the J-Hub, and it does continue to do good work. But my hope was by now that it would have scaled considerably, and other similar organizations inside defense would also have scaled. The truth is, I think, this stuff is still going on at the margins, and that needs to change. I had been in procurement about half my career, capability development and acquisition. It's more towards the senior end of my career than earlier. And what I observed was that the core program was slow in delivery, and it was expensive, and it regularly failed. And yet we had another part of our system, which was to do with the purchase of urgent operational requirements, which could work really quickly and effectively. When I was a brigadier director of equipment capability for ground maneuver, I spent 1.8 billion in about 18 months on protected mobility vehicles and personal protection and all kinds of other things for our forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we saved a lot of lives and did so at a speed that the core program wasn't achieving. So I knew that we could do something different. I read an article in Harvard Business Review by a guy called Scott Anthony, who was part of the Insight team that Clayton Christensen ran. And he said you could create an innovation engine in 6 weeks with 3 people. And that gave me some ideas. You can't do anything in the MOD with 3 people. That's, if you want to create an innovation unit, you have to have it run by at least a brigadier, and it must involve 600 people. That's the kind of natural tendency we have. But so I took Scott's ideas about how to do that, and I translated that into the J-Hub, and it was very successful. By the time I left the department, it was contracting in 9 months from what we call the opportunity assessment to a contract, which is rocket speed in MOD. So it can be done, but it's not yet being done on sufficient scale. I think, to trail something we might go on to talk about, I do think the Strategic Defence Review that's now ongoing is an opportunity to change some things that make that more likely. We still have to have traditional ways of doing procurement for some of the enormous, really complex and very long-term programs, but we can spend more of our intellectual energy working out systems that will work for the people in this audience.
And just quickly, on your reflection of since the J-Hub was started, what would you, knowing what you know now and thinking about the SDR, what would you do differently if you set it up again?
I think I would have done the first period in the same way. I mean, I just think that it needed to be doubled down upon with significant funding associated and uncommitted money. I mean, part of the problem is that you are a startup, you've got great technology, you go and you demonstrate it and you prove it to the satisfaction of a user that it works, and the user then goes to the budgeteers and says, look, this is fantastic technology, we want to adopt it, and the budgeteer says, which part of the existing program do you want me to cut to fund that scaling? And by the way, the existing program in the first few years is all in delivery or contractually committed, and therefore extremely hard to shift. So we need funding that is ring-fenced, and really ring-fenced, because the danger is somebody will pocket it, to allow startups to scale technology in the way that really would have a big impact on defense.
Yeah, thank you. And that leads into a question for you, John, which we have often talked about this, the tail behind the pilot. So instead of having demonstrations, we're having deployments. And in your role of being the head of the Defense Innovation Unit, you're really driving strategic change about innovation, how it's adopted and positioned in defense. What has procurement's role been in that, driving that strategic change? And what is the one thing that if you had the authority to do, if you don't have it now, that would actually change the needle on the relationship between these people in the room and defense as an establishment?
So I'm afraid I'm going to repeat some of what Chris has just said, but our challenge is not on invention. That side of things is really well covered off, both inside defence with some of the sort of grassroots stuff that comes through, and crucially from embracing startups outside defence as well. The problem is not on invention, the problem is around scaling. The tremendous frustration of my current job is the bit that I own, whilst I'm not complacent enough to think that it's brilliant, and I think you're right around, we should have, personal view, I think we should have scaled up the J-Hub as an organisation rather than create lots of little J-Hubs, for example. So that's one element of that. But even if you got our little piece of it working brilliantly, if you haven't got a route to get it out to commercial scaling and exploitation into the full force, it's not an innovation, it's still a bit of a hobby. What's frustrating is it's absolutely possible. So it's not around, you can't do these contracts. So DASA are currently running a trial where they will take from a DASA challenge, down select to a series of promising ideas, get them to bring their prototypes along after a set period, demonstrate their prototypes, down select to one or two from that, and there is a contract at the end, a proper core contract, so that you get that full end-to-end. It's absolutely doable within our systems. It's just we have previously chosen not to do it. But all of that comes down to Chris's point. So unless you have that money in the program somewhere, you can't do it. So my magic wand, which I would wave, is to say at the start of the year, you need 20% of your budget uncommitted. Now, some of that needs to be inside programs so that an SRO is able to say, I now need to bring this sensor and bring it onto my platform that I wasn't expecting to do before. So that will sit within a program. Some of it needs to sit within portfolios so that you can say, if I'm doing counter UAVs, for example, I now want to drop this piece of capability and bring this other one in, and some of it needs to be in the whole program. So you need layers of uncommitted money within each of those. The incentives are not set up to do that. So the incentive for the whole system at the moment is, at the start of the year, lock everything down, underbid to get it on the programme, because once it's on the programme you can't get it off. There are no consequences for blowing your budget. There should be. Once you've then got it on your programme, absolutely make sure that every penny is committed, because at some point in the year, because everyone's overcommitting, they'll then come round with a bowl saying, I need all your money back because that person over there has overspent. All the incentives are set up for that model. So it's not just around having uncommitted money. You also need to change the individual incentives for those involved, particularly on that financial planning side, because without that, the uncommitted money comes out again and you're left back where you started. So it's not, that's my frustration. This isn't a innovator's problem. This is a systemic problem that we need to get at, and I am desperately hoping that the Defence Review has a go at this.
And before we move to Katherine and talking from the company side, I think part of some of my frustration of being a company owner and doing the procurement into government is we hear those things, and that's what we desperately need to do. Who is actually going to do it? And then from the outside, the industry side, who are we going to hold accountable to do that? Because I think that, we've talked about procurement reform. I remember Andrew Forzani, 8 years ago running a whole procurement reform. But we've seen pockets of things to be hopeful about here and there. And what you're talking about is hugely exciting, thinking about it from a systemic, change point of view. Is there a willingness in government to adopt it? So is there viability to do it? And who is actually going to do it? And who will be held accountable to doing it? Because we've seen today, there's no greater time of urgency is now. And we're all feeling it. And we've seen it from the panel yesterday on Ukraine. And so part of this, we can talk about it, but who is actually going to do it? Do you have an indication of who's going to take this on and do it?
So if I kick off on that, our new Secretary of State has been absolutely clear that the current way of doing things is not good enough. So we've had a programme around defence reform that's been going for a while, and he's come in and he said, right, enough's enough. I'm now imposing from the top a different structure at the top of defence to make it much simpler to align responsibilities and accountabilities exactly as you're suggesting. So the appointment of a National Armaments Director as one of the key elements of that to make sure that there's a much more aligned mechanism to do acquisition. So I am as optimistic as I've ever been that there is a chance to do this now, because it's being pushed incredibly hard by political leadership. So it's much harder for people to kind of wriggle off the hook.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
I think Britain is now undergoing its 5th Strategic Defence Review in 15 years, I think. And those have not, they've all talked about acquisition reform. Programmes have resulted which were designed to change the way we did business, but I don't think they have fundamentally changed the system. And you'd have to say, if that has not been true in previous defence reviews, why would it be true now? But I have a lot of confidence, actually, in the team that's been appointed from the outside of the department, although they know and understand the department. I do think there's a real chance to do this now, and I think there is a really strong voice out there that is saying something must be done. So I think the combination of that voice, the combination of the availability of technical solutions now to problems that weren't there previously, and the review, hopefully that will change it. But the whole question of accountability, which you raise, is that we could spend 45 minutes talking about that alone. I do hope that the new structure will deliver a better accountability as well.
That's great. Thank you for that. And Katherine, from your perspective, some of the things that we talked about before I thought were really interesting, which is the way that procurement is, companies and industry is reacting to, and you help startups and you invest in startups. How do you help them navigate, while we're kind of waiting for procurement reform, how do you help them navigate, and what have you seen that has worked in accelerating the integration and adoption from these companies into government?
Yes, and I want to caveat on a couple of the points they covered after I answer this question. So we focus a lot on strategic partnerships, mentor-protege programs, a lot of things that people who haven't worked in defense and the procurement cycle don't necessarily know exist. So we will pair startups with bigs. One of our portfolio companies right now, Air Matrix, we've done a strategic partnership with Boeing, for example, and it was very easy. We were actually approached by Boeing to do it. So there's a lot of opportunity, and I think that a lot of the bigs that are daunting to approach, they're willing to work with the startups, in my experience, and it's good for them to have these set-aside companies as a subcontractor on these contracts. And it gives them the experience past performance. If you do the mentor protege program, there's a lot of the innovation units that are good to work with that we'll approach. We are very active at Softworks. DIU has been great. But to caveat back on the point of a lot of these innovation units and the accountability, some of the things that I've faced, and I know is an industry-wide problem, luckily we have the inner network at a lot of these innovation units that are being stood up where we know who to reach out to outside. But when you go to a lot of the conferences or the summits, they say, this is the tech that we want, these are the requirements, please bring us this tech. And then you ask them, okay, we have the tech or the capability, when can we demonstrate it? We don't need funding, it's already funded, it's through R&D. When can we show it to you, and who do we email, right? Submit something to? And there's never a direct answer, and it's kind of a pass around, and they dodge it. And it seems to, you get to one person and then it falls through. So I think that they need to be much more direct on, this is how you submit, this is how you demo, this is how you tell us which phase you're at, and have a process in place for when they are ready to demonstrate and hand over a capability. If you don't have the proper network, it's very hard to navigate that space, and it does come down to accountability.
So if I had a magic wand, if I might pick up on that, I mean, I would approach procurement reform, acquisition reform, from the perspective of how does MOD become a better customer? I think probably to soothe some egos, I would say, how does it become a different kind of customer? But I would start by acknowledging that MOD is a very poor customer. That's where I'd go first, and it's a mindset change. If you were out there with a big business and you had the reputation as a customer that the MOD has, you'd sit down and think very carefully, what do I need to do differently to be better? And I think there are a tremendous array of things to do with communication, transparency, and a whole array of other things that people would normally put under the heading of acquisition reform. But I think they could be approached from the perspective of, let's make MOD a world-class customer, because it could be.
So I'm not going to fight the defence on this, but what I will do is try and contextualise some of why that's a problem, because every time I get frustrated with a bit of the system, I think it's worth stepping back and trying to understand the individual motivations. If you are a commercial officer in the D&S, when someone says, I want you to move a bit faster on this thing and take a bit of commercial risk and maybe a bit of legal risk here, that is all downside risk. There is no upside risk to that individual at all.
I'm not disagreeing with John, but this is not their fault. But we need to change the system.
And that's exactly my point. So my point is, what we need to do is work out why those incentives are in place. So the fact that we compartment our commercial risk and put it over there under a DG commercial and basically say your job is to make that zero. And then we put the operational risk and we say to Chief of Joint Operations, you're in charge of operational risk. Oh, by the way, you get no say in that commercial thing over there. And the financial bit, that's under DG Fin. So somehow we've got to bring these things together so that we're making holistic judgments around what that looks like. That requires a restructuring, because unless you change the individual motivations, it sort of doesn't matter what we keep saying. The individual's got to behave differently. And for me, that's a fundamental part of it. And on the better customers, that's how you get venture in. Because if you're a good customer and they're seeing companies that are then getting orders, not prototype stuff, but proper orders on their books, they will come in because it's suddenly profitable and they'll get a return. It's not... We're not going to make venture turn up by saying, give us more money from the private sector to fund these companies. You get it by them being a return on it. It really is as simple as that, I think.
So, but being a better customer, this is for all of you, what skills are required to implement that type of structural and system change you're talking about? So what would you see a commercial person doing differently in their job on Monday than they're doing today if that system works?
So I'll give you one good example. So the Spearheads program that we part fund, so if I take the anti-submarine warfare Spearhead, the commercial officer is embedded in the team. So their motivation when they turn up at work is, I am going to make the Spearhead deliver awesome capability for Navy undersea warfare specialists. They're not on speed dial in a completely different organisation. So immersing them in the culture of that team, where the outcome for the team is what motivates them, that's a really important change of behaviours.
Okay.
I would start by asking, outside defence, outside government, what does a good customer look like? And learning from experience from other sectors. But I also think it's a mindset. You know, it's not so much a skill, it's a mindset. Do we think we could be a better customer? Because until we do, there's no prospect of change. But if we came at it from that perspective, and I think that people think that this is a zero-sum game. That if the MOD is striving to be a better customer, then the winner is the supplier and the loser is the MOD. Yeah. I mean, and it absolutely is nonsense that it is a zero-sum game. If the MOD was a better customer, everybody would win.
Yeah, that's a great point, thank you. Katherine, if you want to close out the panel with your thoughts, and what would you see, because you're on the coalface with these companies, seeing them try to navigate and get into government. What skills would you see that would be a game changer on the government side, whether that's a commercial officer, whether that's an end user? What would make a difference?
Definitely the accountability, follow-up, making it a much more transparent process. There's a lot of invitation and a lot of summits that are taking place, but again, there's very little follow-up if you don't know the right buttons to press internally. If you haven't made those connections and don't have that network in place, it is near to impossible unless you happen to catch them on a good day. That is the honest experience, unfortunately. But I think that it will grow. It is, you see new people coming in on different programs who understand the pains, and I've seen some changes in the way things are being done with some of the innovation units. So it is positive direction, but we need to do more, I believe.
Agreed. Well, thank you all very much for your answers and being so candid, and looking forward to the new SDR and all of the promises it's going to bring us. So thank you to the panel.